The river holds many secrets, but none so strange as the face that stares back from its depths. They say she walked into the current and never came out, but she didn't truly leave. We try to steer around her, but it's no use. When the moonlight hits the water just right, you see her, clear as day, her eyes wide open, watching. Her reflection never moves, not for the paddle wheels, not for the storms, not for the prayers of the righteous or the curses of the damned. She just watches, a ghost made of water and memory, waiting for a justice the world of the living denied her. But what drove a woman to become a permanent haunting fixture in the mighty Mississippi? And what happens to those who dare to look too long into her watery eyes? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The sun over Natchez was a merciless tyrant, a white-hot eye in a bleached sky, and Eliza felt its weight on her back like a physical blow. It pressed down on the cotton fields of the Covington plantation, baking the earth into a cracked, dusty plate and sucking the very breath from the air. Each inhale was a sip of fire. The air, thick as molasses, shimmered above the endless rows of green and white, distorting the world into a wavering, dreamlike state of suffering. Eliza's fingers, calloused and stained, moved with a practiced economy, plucking the fluffy bowls from their thorny prisons. The sharp edges of the bracts were a familiar pain, a constant series of small violations that she had long ago learned to ignore. Her movements were weary but deliberate, a slow, rhythmic dance of endurance that had been her life for as long as she could remember. Sweat traced paths through the grime on her skin, stinging her eyes and tasting of salt on her lips. Around her, the field was a symphony of misery, the rustle of cotton plants punctuated by the low groans of the weary and the sharp, cutting commands of the overseer on his horse, a distant and menacing silhouette against the blinding glare. Eliza, however, remained silent. Her silence was a fortress, the one piece of herself that Master Covington could not own, could not whip, and could not sell. Inside that quiet, her spirit was not broken but honed to a fine, sharp point of observation. She saw everything, the subtle shift in the overseer's posture that signaled his rising anger, the tremor in a young boy's hand as he reached for a gourd of water, the way the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks seemed to weep in the suffocating humidity. Her internal world was a deep well of pain, but it was also a reservoir of fierce, unyielding strength. As twilight bled across the sky, softening the brutal edges of the day, the slaves trudged back to the quarters. The collection of rough-hewn cabins was a world unto itself, a place of shared sorrows and stolen joys. Eliza found Hattie sitting on a small stool outside her cabin, her hands, gnarled as ancient roots, methodically shelling peas into a wooden bowl. Hattie was older, her face a roadmap of years Eliza could only imagine, and her eyes held a wisdom that was both comforting and unsettling. She looked up as Eliza approached, a faint smile touching her lips. "Sit, child. Rest your bones." Eliza sank onto the packed earth beside her, the ache in her back and shoulders a dull, constant fire. Hattie pushed a small bowl of corn mush and greens toward her. It was meager, but it was warm, and they ate in a companionable silence for a few moments, the sounds of the quarters settling around them, a low murmur of voices, the cry of a baby, the distant strum of a makeshift banjo. "The river sings a song of freedom, child," Hattie said, her voice a low rasp. But you gotta have feet on the ground to dance to it. She paused, her dark eyes fixed on Eliza's face, a face that had grown too still, too guarded. You been catching the master's eye again. Be careful. A quiet face on a woman like you. He don't see it as peace. He sees it as a challenge. Eliza's hands stilled around her bowl. She offered no reply, but the slight tightening of her jaw was answer enough. She knew Hattie was right. Master Covington did not tolerate anything he could not understand. And he did not understand the woman who met his gaze without flinching, whose spirit refused to bow even as her body toiled. The summons came an hour later, delivered by a house slave with averted eyes. Eliza was needed at the master's house. A dinner party. She washed her face and hands in the basin of cool water. The simple act, a small ritual of purification, of preparing for a different kind of violation. The great house was another world. A universe of polished wood, glittering crystal, and the cloying scent of beeswax and perfume. Laughter, loud and brittle, spilled from the dining room. Eliza moved through the periphery, a shadow in a homespun dress, her task to refill wine glasses and clear plates without being seen, without existing. But Master Covington would not allow her that grace. He was holding court at the head of the table, his face flushed with wine and self-importance. As Eliza reached to clear his plate, he grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. The table fell silent. "This is Eliza," he announced to his guests, his voice slurring slightly. "A fine specimen, is she not? Strong back, good hands, but a sullen face." He turned his cruel gaze on her, his eyes glittering. "Smile, girl. A valuable thing should at least look pleasant. Your face is a poor advertisement for my investment." The words hung in the air, each one a lash. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Eliza. She felt the eyes of everyone at the table on her, a mixture of pity, amusement, and indifference. She did not smile. She simply looked at him, her expression unchanging, her silence a shield. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he released her with a grunt of disgust, and the brittle laughter resumed, a little too loud, a little too forced. Eliza did not return to the quarters. She walked past the cabins, past the familiar sounds and smells, and took the path that led down to the river. The Mississippi was her sanctuary, a vast, moving presence that dwarfed the petty cruelties of the plantation. The sun was setting, a spectacular explosion of orange and purple that painted the surface of the water with fire. She stood on the muddy bank, the air cool and damp against her heated skin. A young field hand, Joseph, approached her hesitantly, his bare feet making no sound on the soft earth. He was barely a man, his face still holding the softness of youth, but his eyes were old with the knowledge of their shared bondage. He held out a single, vibrant wild flower, a splash of defiant yellow against the encroaching dusk. "This river, it could take us north, Eliza," he whispered, his voice filled with a desperate hope. "We could be free." Eliza looked from the flower to his earnest face. She saw in him a future she could never have, a path of flight and fear and the constant threat of being dragged back. She gave him a sad, knowing look, a look that held all the reasons she could not go, all the chains, both visible and invisible, that bound her to this place. He seemed to understand. His hand dropped, and after a moment, he turned and melted back into the twilight, leaving her alone. Eliza looked down at the water. Her reflection stared back. A water sister, a companion who understood her silence. The current distorted her face, making it look both familiar and strange, her features wavering as if she were already becoming part of the river. The water was cool, dark, and inviting. Her decision was not one of panic, but of calm, final release. It was the only choice she had left, the only act of self-possession available to her. The next morning, Eliza was gone. Her absence was noted not with alarm, but with irritation. The overseer organized a frantic, yet perfunctory search. He and a few others rowed along the riverbank, their calls echoing hollowly over the water. They were looking for property, not a person. In the quarters, a heavy silence fell. Hattie knew. She walked the same path Eliza had taken the night before, her old heart a leaden weight in her chest. Near the water's edge, half trodden into the mud, she found it, a single, worn ribbon of faded blue that Eliza had used to tie back her hair. Hattie picked it up, her fingers trembling, and clutched it to her chest. The river offered no other clues. It flowed on, immense and indifferent, holding its secrets in its deep, dark heart. Eliza was presumed drowned. Another loss calculated in dollars and cents, soon to be forgotten by those who had owned her. A few nights later, two young boys, sons of a sharecropper, crept down to the river to fish in the moonlight. The air was still, and the moon was a silver coin in the black velvet sky, its light casting a shimmering path across the water. They cast their lines and waited, their whispers loud in the profound silence of the night. It was the younger boy who saw it first. He gasped, his fishing pole slipping from his grasp. "Look," he breathed, his voice tight with a mixture of terror and wonder. The older boy followed his gaze. There, on the surface of the water, where the moonlight was brightest, was a face. It was not a reflection of the moon, not a trick of the light on the current. It was the face of a woman, perfectly clear, her skin the color of dusky twilight, her eyes wide open and serene. Her expression was calm, unblinking, and impossibly present. The water rippled around it, but the face itself remained perfectly still, a fixed point in the moving river. It was Eliza's face. The boys stared, frozen for a heartbeat, their minds refusing to accept what their eyes were seeing. Then, a primal fear broke the spell. They scrambled backward, tripping over roots and stones, their screams tearing through the silence of the night as they fled into the darkness, leaving the woman in the water to her eternal, silent watch. The story of the two terrified boys spread like wildfire, first through the hushed, anxious network of the slave quarters. It was a story told in whispers over cooking fires, in furtive glances across the cotton rows, a secret currency of fear and wonder. At first, it was just that, a children's ghost story, a frightful tale born of moonlight and overactive imaginations. But the story had the ring of a deeper truth, and it clung to the air like the humid Natchez fog. It changed in the telling, as all such stories do. Some said Eliza's eyes glowed with a cold fire. Others swore they heard her humming a mournful tune that traveled on the wind. The tale seeped out of the quarters, carried on the lips of house servants and stable hands, and began to poison the well of white society. In the parlors and saloons of Natchez, it was dismissed with a nervous laugh, a piece of macabre folklore. Yet, the story persisted, a stubborn weed in the town's collective consciousness. It became the story of the river face, a name that was both clumsy and chillingly accurate. For the enslaved, however, it was something more. It was not a haunting, but a presence, a testament. Eliza had not simply vanished into the river, she had merged with it, transforming her suffering into a permanent, unmovable act of witness. Her silence in life had become an eternal, watchful gaze in death. And in that gaze, they found a strange and defiant comfort. The rumors eventually reached the ears of Master Covington, delivered by his flustered overseer, a man named Miller who twisted the brim of his hat as he spoke. Covington was in his study, a decanter of brandy at his elbow, the scent of leather and old paper thick in the air. As he listened, his face, already florid from the drink, darkened to a shade of deep purple. The veins in his temples pulsed. It was one thing for a slave to run, to drown, to be lost as property. It was another thing entirely for her to become a legend, an act of insubordination that reached back from beyond the grave. Superstition, he spat, slamming his fist on the polished mahogany desk. Lies spread by the lazy and the foolish to scare themselves out of a day's work. He saw it for what it was, a continuation of the quiet defiance she had shown him in life. Her unblinking stare at his dinner party was now magnified, reflected in the very river that had claimed her. The thought filled him with a white, hot rage. He would not have it. He would not be mocked by a ghost. The next morning, under the harsh, unforgiving light of day, he rode his finest stallion down to the riverbank, Miller trailing nervously behind him. He dismounted and strode to the water's edge, his boots sinking into the soft mud. He stared at the river, his eyes scanning the brown, swirling surface. There was nothing, only the muddy current, carrying silt and debris downstream. The sun glinted off the water, momentarily blinding him. He saw no face, no serene expression, no watchful eyes. He saw only the river, vast and empty. He turned to Miller, a sneer twisting his lips. "Find who is spreading these lies and whip them," he commanded, his voice cutting through the morning calm. "A runaway is a runaway, not some water spirit. I will not have my authority undermined by slave superstition." He mounted his horse and rode away, convinced he had put an end to the foolishness, but a seed of unease had been planted. The emptiness of the river in the daylight felt less like proof of absence and more like a deliberate concealment, as if the water itself were hiding its secret from his prying eyes. That night, under the same silver moon that had terrified the sharecropper's boys, Hattie and Joseph made their own pilgrimage to the river. Hattie carried a small, flickering lantern, though the moonlight was bright enough to see by. Joseph walked beside her, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. They moved in silence, the weight of their purpose heavy between them. When they reached the spot, the place where Hattie had found the faded blue ribbon, they stopped. They looked out at the water, their breath held tight in their chests, and they saw it. It was just as the stories had described. In a patch of water, where the moonlight pooled like liquid silver, Eliza's face was there. It was not a reflection, for it was brighter than the surrounding water, and it held a depth, a substance, that light alone could not create. Her eyes were open. Her expression was one of profound and unshakable serenity. The current flowed around her, but her image remained as still as a portrait painted on glass. Hattie let out a soft, shuddering sob, a sound of grief and awe mingled together. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks, but she did not look away. Joseph fell to his knees in the mud, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Eliza, come back, please." He spoke to the face in the water, his words a torrent of grief and confusion, begging her to return, to undo this strange and terrible magic. The face only watched, its calm expression a stark, heartbreaking contrast to his anguish. Hattie placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That ain't our Eliza no more, child," she said, her voice low and steady, though her tears still flowed. "That's her power. That's her memory. You speak to it with respect." Joseph looked up at her, his eyes wide with a dawning understanding. He fell silent, his pleas dying on his lips. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden bird he had been working on for weeks, a secret gift he had intended for Eliza. With a trembling hand, he tossed it into the water. It landed with a soft splash just beyond the image of her face and was immediately caught by the current, swept away into the darkness. The face in the water remained, a silent, eternal guardian, the legend of the river. Face grew, and with it, the arrogance of those who refused to believe. Captain Brody was one such man. He was a riverboat pilot, a big, barrel-chested man with a booming laugh and a profound contempt for anything he could not explain with logic or dismiss with mockery. His paddle wheeler, the Natchez Queen, was his kingdom, and he ruled it with an iron fist and a loud mouth. As he navigated the currents of the Mississippi, he heard the whispers from his crew and the passengers about the haunting. He laughed it off. A ghost in the water? He'd bellow to his crew, his voice echoing over the rhythmic churn of the paddle wheels, made up by fools to scare children. One evening, as he approached the stretch of river near the old Covington plantation, his first mate pointed out the spot, his voice hushed with a nervous reverence. A few passengers had gathered on the deck, hoping to catch a glimpse of the phenomenon. Brody scoffed, a look of theatrical disdain on his face. "Pay no mind to that nonsense," he announced, his voice carrying to the onlookers. "We'll plow right through that ghost and see what she's made of." He made a great show of steering the Natchez Queen directly toward the area where the reflection was said to appear. The boat surged forward, its massive paddle wheels churning the water into a violent, frothing chaos. Right over the sacred spot, the passengers gasped, and some of the crew crossed themselves, but nothing happened. Brody let out a triumphant laugh. "See? Nothing but muddy water." The next day, as the Natchez Queen was docked miles downriver in New Orleans, a fire broke out. It started deep in the hull. In the engine room, a place of steel, steam, and sweat, the flames erupted with an unnatural speed and intensity, licking at the greasy machinery with a strange, hungry fury. The crew, caught by surprise, scrambled to fight the blaze. Panic ensued. The fire was eventually extinguished, but not before it had crippled the engine and caused significant damage to the vessel. An official investigation was launched, but the cause could not be determined. It was ruled an accident, a stray spark, a mechanical failure. But the men who had been in the engine room told a different story in hushed, fearful tones. They spoke of the fire not spreading, but appearing in multiple places at once, of the flames burning with a cold blue light, and of a strange, humming sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the boat just before the fire began. Captain Brodie was a changed man. The booming laugh was gone, replaced by a tight, fearful silence. He sold his share in the Natchez Queen and was never seen piloting a riverboat again. The whispers now had a new, sharper edge. The river face was not just a passive observer. It was a protector, and it had a power that could reach out and touch those who dared to disrespect it. The incident with the Natchez Queen fractured the town's skepticism. Natchez became a community divided against itself. The story of Eliza was no longer a piece of morbid gossip. It was a pressing, controversial issue. In the taverns, arguments broke out, with believers and scoffers nearly coming to blows. Wealthy landowners and merchants, men of logic and commerce, demanded that the haunting be dealt with. They spoke of it as a public nuisance, a threat to river trade and the town's reputation. They pressured the sheriff to do something, though no one was quite sure what could be done. In the churches, ministers took to their pulpits, their sermons thundering with condemnation. They preached of the devil's work, of a pagan spirit conjured from the dark heart of the river, a manifestation of sin designed to lead the faithful astray. They called for prayer and fasting to cleanse the town of this evil influence. For the enslaved community, the story was the opposite. Eliza's reflection was not a curse, but a blessing, a guardian. They saw the fire on the Natchez Queen as an act of righteous retribution. She was their saint, a protector who watched over them from her watery sanctuary. They began to see her as a symbol of their own endurance, a spirit that, like them, could not be broken, could not be erased. The riverbank became a holy site. They warned their children not to play near the water's edge, not out of fear of the reflection, but out of respect for it. The social fabric of Natchez, already stretched thin by the deep divisions of race and class, began to fray. The town was caught in a tug of war between belief and denial, between the fear of the supernatural and the terror of acknowledging the profound injustice that had created it. And all the while, the face in the water remained, its serene, unblinking gaze, the calm, silent center of the growing storm. It watched as the town tore itself apart, its presence a constant, quiet reminder of a truth the world of the living had tried and failed. The growing storm of rumor and fear in Natchez drove Master Covington to the edge of his sanity. Publicly, he maintained a facade of contemptuous dismissal, but privately, he was a man besieged. Eliza's face, the one he had tried to break in life, now haunted him from the water, its placid gaze a more potent challenge than any spoken word. He began to see it everywhere, in the reflection of his brandy glass, in the polished surface of his boots, in the dark, accusing pools of his own shadow. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams filled with swirling brown water and serene, unblinking eyes. Desperate, he shed his pride like a snake sheds its skin, and sought a solution in the very world of superstition he so loudly decried. He sent a discreet message, and a week later, a man arrived in Natchez. He was a traveling preacher, a gaunt figure with feverish eyes and a threadbare black coat, who claimed a special talent for banishing spirits. For a hefty price, paid in secret, he agreed to perform an exorcism. They met at the river's edge as dusk began to settle, a time when the boundary between worlds felt thin and permeable. Covington stood back, his arms crossed, a thunderous expression on his face, while the preacher unpacked his tools of the trade, a tarnished silver cross, a bottle of holy water, and a thick, leather-bound Bible. The preacher began his ritual, his voice rising in a dramatic, theatrical chant, condemning the unclean spirit that had taken root in the water. He sprinkled the holy water, which hissed as it hit the surface, and held his cross aloft as if to ward off a physical blow. A small, localized wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves of the cypress trees and making the preacher's voice tremble. He lit a circle of thick tallow candles around him, their flames flickering wildly in the sudden breeze. "By the power of the Almighty, I command you, foul spirit, depart from this place," he bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of fervor and fear. As he spoke, the sky above them, which had been clear moments before, darkened with an unnatural speed. The wind grew from a breeze to a gale, whipping the river into a frenzy. A sudden, violent downpour erupted, confined to the small patch of land where they stood. It drenched the preacher in an instant, plastering his thin hair to his skull and soaking his Bible. The candles were extinguished with a collective hiss, plunging them into a deeper gloom. The preacher stood, stunned and sputtering, as the storm raged around him. He looked at the river, through the churning waves and the driving rain. In the one spot he had been trying to cleanse, the water was preternaturally calm, and there, clearer and more present than ever, was Eliza's face, its serene expression, a silent, powerful rebuke. The preacher let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure terror. He dropped his cross and his ruined Bible in the mud and scrambled away, slipping and sliding up the slick bank. He did not look back. Covington found him later, cowering in a stable, his bravado shattered. "There is a power here," the preacher stammered, his teeth chattering from cold and fright, "that is not of God or the devil, but of the earth itself. I can do nothing." He took Covington's money and fled Natchez before dawn, leaving the master alone with his immovable ghost. The failure of the exorcism, a story that leaked out despite Covington's attempts to suppress it, solidified the legend's power. The economic consequences, once a vague threat, began to materialize. Captain Brodie's fate had become a cautionary tale whispered from port to port along the Mississippi. Riverboat captains, a pragmatic and superstitious lot, began to alter their routes. They started giving the haunted stretch of water near the Covington plantation a wide berth, steering their vessels toward the opposite bank. This deviation created a strange and noticeable phenomenon on the river, a kind of invisible barrier that forced all traffic to one side. It became known as the empty lane. At first it was a minor inconvenience, but the river was the lifeblood of commerce, and the empty lane soon caused delays and navigational challenges. Schedules were disrupted. Shipments of cotton and timber from upriver were late arriving in New Orleans. Merchants in the city, men who measured life in ledgers and profit margins, grew impatient. They sent letters of complaint, demanding to know why their cargo was being held up by what sounded like a childish ghost story. The empty lane was no longer a local curiosity. It was a disruption of trade, a problem that had a cost in dollars and cents, and it drew the kind of unwanted attention from powerful men that made plantation owners like Covington deeply uncomfortable. The river, which had once been a symbol of his wealth and access to the wider world, was now a source of public embarrassment and financial strain, all because of the silent, watery gaze of a woman he had thought he had erased. Covington's frustration, fed by public scrutiny and private terror, curdled into a desperate, violent obsession. If spiritual means had failed, he would turn to the physical. He would destroy the reflection with brute force. He was a man who believed in the power of iron and stone, in the ability of a master to impose his will upon the world. He ordered his most trusted hands, men whose fear of him outweighed their fear of the river spirit, to accompany him to the bank. He would not be a passive observer this time. He would be a general in a war against an apparition. First, he had them gather large, heavy stones from the edge of the fields. He stood, his face a mask of grim determination, and directed them to hurl the rocks into the water, directly at the spot where the face appeared. The stones hit the surface with loud, satisfying splashes, sending ripples spreading outwards. The water churned, the muddy bottom disturbed, but when the ripples subsided and the silt settled, the face was still there, its calm expression completely unchanged, as if the stones had passed through it like smoke. Covington's face twitched, a muscle jumping in his jaw. He screamed at the men to throw more, to throw faster. They worked until their arms ached, until a small mound of stones lay uselessly on the riverbed below, having accomplished nothing. The next day, he escalated his assault. He had the men bring heavy logging chains from the barn, thick, rusted links of iron that were used to drag massive cypress logs from the swamp. His plan was to drag the very bottom of the river, to physically disrupt the water and mud and whatever trick of light was creating the illusion. The men, their faces pale with dread, waded into the shallows, dragging the heavy chains behind them. They cast them out into the deeper water, and with immense effort began to drag them across the spot. The chains scraped against the riverbed, churning up mud and weeds, creating a chaotic, brown soup of the water. Covington watched, his breath coming in ragged gasps, a wild, hopeful light in his eyes. He could hear the grating sound of the iron links against rock and gravel. This had to work. It was a physical attack on a physical place. But as the men pulled the last of the chain to the shore, and the turbulent water once again grew still, the image resolved itself out of the murky depths. The face returned, serene, patient, and utterly undisturbed. It seemed to Covington that its gaze was more direct now, more knowing. He felt a wave of dizzying, impotent rage. He began to mutter to himself, his voice a low, venomous hiss that was barely audible over the gentle lapping of the water. "She mocks me," he whispered, pacing the muddy bank like a caged animal. "From inside the water, she mocks me. It is not possible. It is not possible." His men watched him, their eyes wide with fear, not of the river, but of the man who was so clearly losing his mind in his war against a memory. The news of Covington's failed attempts to destroy the reflection traveled back to the quarters, where it was met not with triumph, but with a solemn, knowing sadness. Joseph, who still visited the riverbank in secret, was consumed by a grief that was slowly hardening into a cold, sharp anger. He could not understand the source of Eliza's immense power, the reason for her unyielding presence. He sought out Hattie, finding her mending a worn shirt by the fading light of the day. He sat beside her, the question that had been tormenting him finally spilling out. "Why, Hattie?" he asked, his voice low and pained. "Why is she still here? What gives her the strength to stand against him even now?" Hattie put down her sewing, her old hands resting in her lap. She looked at Joseph, her eyes filled with a profound sorrow. She knew that to answer his question, she would have to give him a burden of truth that would change him forever. She decided he was old enough and strong enough to carry it. "You think her spirit was broken by the whip or the sun or his cruel words?" she began, her voice a near whisper. "But that ain't it. The thing that broke Eliza, the thing that sent her to that river, was something else. It happened about a year ago." She paused, gathering her strength, the memory still a fresh wound. Eliza had a child, a little girl, as bright and beautiful as a sunrise. She was Eliza's heart, her reason for breathing. Covington knew it. He saw the love she had for that child, and he saw it as a weakness, another thing he could own. Hattie's voice trembled, and she had to stop to wipe a tear from her eye. He sold her, sold that little girl downriver, for no reason other than to show his power, to watch Eliza's heart break. He took her heart and sold it downriver. She looked from Joseph's horrified face toward the distant, darkening line of the river. What was left for her to do but give the rest of herself to the water? The river was the only thing that couldn't be bought or sold. It was the only place she could go where he couldn't follow, where she could keep a piece of herself that was truly her own. Joseph stared at her, the blood draining from his face. The story landed on him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Eliza's quiet suffering, her sullen look, her final calm walk to the water. It all snapped into a new, horrifying focus. His grief for the woman he had known was suddenly eclipsed by a vast, cold rage for the mother whose child had been stolen. He stopped pleading with the reflection in his nightly visits. He began to understand its purpose. It was not a plea for help. It was a verdict. It was the unblinking eye of justice, a mother's memory holding a murderer accountable in the only way she could. The legend of the river face had by now become a piece of morbid tourism. Carriages carrying wealthy families from Natchez, or even as far as Vicksburg, would sometimes detour along the dusty river road, their occupants hoping for a Gothic thrill. One sweltering afternoon, a particularly opulent carriage, drawn by 4 perfectly matched white horses, pulled to a stop near the infamous spot. A young woman, dressed in layers of pale blue silk and lace, her face shaded by a delicate parasol, insisted that the party stop. She was the daughter of a shipping magnate, a girl whose life had been a seamless progression of comfort and indulgence. The story of the river face intrigued her. It was a dramatic, romantic tale, and she wanted to see it for herself. Her family protested, but she was willful and accustomed to getting her way. She stepped down from the carriage, her entourage trailing behind her, and walked to the edge of the high, crumbling bank. She peered down, her expression one of bored curiosity. The sun was bright, and at first she saw nothing but the glare on the brown water. Then, as a cloud passed overhead, the light shifted, and she saw it. The face was there, just as the stories claimed, but it was not what she had expected. It was not a faint, ghostly image. It was solid, real, and its eyes, deep and dark, seemed to be looking directly at her. In that instant, the world around her fell away. The humid air grew cold. The chirping of the cicadas faded to silence. All she could see, all she could feel, were those eyes. They were not angry. They were not sad. They were simply knowing. She felt a profound and terrifying sense of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. The reflection's gaze stripped away her fine dress, her family's wealth, her petty vanities. It saw the core of her, the triviality of her concerns, the emptiness of her privileged existence, and found it wanting. A wave of vertigo and self-loathing washed over her. Her breath caught in her throat. Her parasol slipped from her numb fingers, and with a small, sighing sound, she fainted, collapsing in a heap of silk and lace on the dusty ground. Her family rushed to her side, fanning her face and loosening her corset. When she came to, she was hysterical, babbling about the eyes in the water. Her father, a man of immense pride and influence, was mortified. The incident was quickly and thoroughly hushed up, but the young woman was changed. She became quiet and withdrawn, prone to long periods of melancholy, and she could never again bear to look at her own reflection in a mirror. The power of Eliza's memory was not just for the superstitious or the guilty. It was a mirror that showed the truth to anyone who dared to look, a truth that some souls were too fragile to bear. The news of the empty lane on the Mississippi, a bizarre navigational anomaly born of superstition, traveled farther than the scent of magnolia on a summer night. It drifted upriver on steam packets and downriver on cotton barges, eventually finding its way into the dry, ink-stained pages of the Boston Daily Chronicle. It was there, in a small column dedicated to strange tidings from the provinces, that Alistair Finch first read about the river face of Natchez. Alistair was a man of his time, which is to say, a man who believed in the steady, triumphant march of reason. He was a journalist and an amateur scientist, his mind a well-ordered cabinet of facts, theories, and logical deductions. To him, the world was a series of puzzles to be solved, and superstition was simply the rust of an unenlightened age. He saw the story from Natchez not as a tale of the supernatural, but as a perfect case study in collective delusion, a folktale ripe for debunking. Carrying a leather satchel containing a meticulously kept notebook, a thermometer, a hydrometer for measuring water density, and a healthy dose of northeastern skepticism, he journeyed south. His arrival in Natchez was a study in contrasts. Alistair, with his tailored wool coat, which was wholly unsuited for the oppressive humidity, and his precise, clipped manner of speaking, was as foreign to the languid, decaying grandeur of the city as a gear in a flower bed. He observed the muddy streets, the opulent columned houses that seemed to be slowly surrendering to the creeping vines and the suffocating heat, and the palpable tension that hung in the air, a silence that was heavier than any sound. He had imagined a town caught in the grip of a quaint, harmless myth. Instead, he found a place that felt genuinely haunted, not by a spirit, but by something far more tangible, a deep, unspoken sickness of the soul. Every legend has a rational core, he wrote in his notebook on his first evening, the scratching of his pen, a small defiant sound against the cacophony of cicadas, a trick of the light, a confluence of natural phenomena, or a collective delusion born of fear. I am here to find it. His first logical step was to seek an interview with the man at the center of the human part of the drama, Master Covington. Getting access was not easy. The Covington plantation was no longer a hub of commerce and society. It had become a fortress, its gates closed to the outside world. Alistair's press credentials and his air of detached academic purpose eventually granted him entry. What he found was a domain in the throes of decay. The once manicured gardens were overgrown with weeds. Paint was peeling from the columns of the great house, and an air of profound neglect hung over everything. Covington himself was a ruin. Alistair was shown into the same dark, mahogany study where Covington had once plotted his business and his cruelties. The man who greeted him was a shadow of the powerful planter he was reputed to be. His fine clothes were stained and disheveled, his hands trembled with a perpetual tremor, and his eyes, bloodshot and wild, darted around the room as if expecting an attack. The interview was a disaster. Alistair began with his calm, methodical questions. But Covington was beyond rational discourse. He was a man drowning in his own paranoia. "You're one of them, aren't you?" Covington hissed, his voice a dry rasp. He pointed a trembling finger at Alistair. "Come down here from the north to right your lies, to take her side." Alistair attempted to steer the conversation back to the facts of Eliza's disappearance, but Covington was lost in his own nightmarish narrative. "They are all in on it," he ranted, pacing the room like a caged beast. "The whole town, the captains on the river, the gossips in the church, my own people. She has poisoned them against me. From the water she whispers to them, turning them against their master." He stopped and stared at Alistair, a sliver of his old cruel arrogance flashing in his eyes. "But I will have the last word. I will." Alistair listened, his pen still, the planned interview abandoned. He was no longer a journalist documenting a folk tale. He was a physician observing the final stages of a terminal disease. The disease was guilt, and it was consuming Covington from the inside out. Alistair left the plantation not with a single verifiable fact, but with the chilling certainty that the story of the river face was rooted in a crime so profound it had driven a man completely mad. Frustrated, Alistair turned his attention to the town itself. He found the white citizens of Natchez to be a wall of polite, unhelpful silence. The gentry, embarrassed by the notoriety, refused to speak of it. The common folk, a mixture of fear and morbid excitement, offered only wild, contradictory exaggerations. They spoke of a face that wept tears of blood, of a voice that called out the names of sinners. Alistair meticulously noted these tales as examples of mythic accretion, but they brought him no closer to the truth. His instincts told him the truth did not reside in the big houses or the noisy taverns. It resided in the silence, in the places and people who were ignored. It led him, cautiously, to the slave quarters of the surrounding plantations, a world governed by its own laws, its own language of survival. He knew his presence there was an intrusion, that a white man asking questions was a harbinger of trouble. He was met with averted eyes and mumbled non-answers. They had no reason to trust him, and every reason to fear him. He had almost given up when he found Hattie. He saw her sitting outside a small, neat cabin, her hands busy with some mending, her posture radiating a quiet, unshakable dignity. She did not look away as he approached, but watched him with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. He did not begin with questions. He simply stood, a respectful distance away, and waited. Finally, she spoke, her voice a low, melodic rasp. "You from up north," she stated. It was not a question. "Come to look at our ghost." Alistair nodded. "I've come to find the truth." Hattie gave a low, humorless chuckle. She looked down at the worn fabric in her hands, and then back at him. "You write things in your book," she said, nodding toward his satchel. "But can your book hold the weight of a mother's soul? Some truths ain't meant for paper. They're meant for the water." Alistair felt he was being tested. He put his satchel down. "I don't know," he answered, honestly. "But I know a man is rotting in his house because of this story, and a town is tearing itself apart. I want to understand why." He met her gaze directly, and in his eyes, she did not see the morbid curiosity of the other white folk, or the cold calculation of a man looking for a spectacle. She saw a genuine, weary desire for understanding. She patted the rough, hewn bench beside her. "Sit," she said. He sat, and for a long time, she was silent, as if weighing the cost of her words. Then, in the quiet of the late afternoon, with the sounds of the quarters a low murmur around them, she gave him the truth. She told him about Eliza, not the sullen, defiant slave of Covington's rants, but the quiet, gentle woman with a spirit as deep and strong as the river itself. She told him of Eliza's love for her daughter, a love that was the sun and moon of her world. And then Hattie's voice dropped to a near whisper, and she recounted the day that had broken the world. It was not just that Covington had sold the child. It was the way he had done it. He had called Eliza to the great house, and with a smile on his face, a leisurely, self-satisfied smile, he had told her. Hattie's voice trembled as she relayed the words she had overheard that day. He told her he sold her little girl to a cane plantation in Louisiana. Hattie whispered, her eyes fixed on a point in the distant past, a place where the sun kills you faster than the whip. He told her he did it just to see that look on her face, that look of hope finally dying. He said, "Now you have nothing left to smile for," and he laughed. The air in the small cabin grew thick and heavy, charged with the weight of this monstrous casual cruelty. Alistair felt a coldness spread through his chest, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. He finally understood. It was not just a mother's grief. It was a specific, calculated act of soul murder. Hattie fell silent. Alistair realized he had stopped breathing. His notebook lay forgotten in his satchel. He was no longer a journalist. He was a witness. That evening, Alistair walked to the river. The story Hattie had told him had changed everything. He was no longer on a scientific expedition to debunk a myth. He felt now like he was approaching a sacred site, a memorial to an unbearable tragedy. He carried his instruments, but it was more out of habit than hope. He set them up on the muddy bank, a man dutifully going through the motions of a faith he had already lost. He measured the water's temperature. He measured its turbidity and its current. The river was just a river, a collection of physical properties, of water and silt and motion. His instruments gave him numbers, data, facts. They told him nothing. As dusk bled into night, and a sliver of moon rose in the sky, he packed away his tools. He sat on the bank, the sounds of the night enveloping him, and simply watched the water. He was not looking for anything now. He was just bearing witness, as Hattie had. And then, It happened. It did not appear with a sudden shock. It resolved itself slowly, gently, out of the dark water. In a patch of moonlight, the face began to form. It was not a reflection. It had depth, substance, and a soft internal luminescence. It was Eliza's face, exactly as Hattie had described it. Her eyes open, her expression one of infinite, heartbreaking serenity. It defied physics. It defied logic. It defied everything Alistair Finch had ever believed. He felt no fear, the terror of the young boys, the psychological horror of the wealthy woman, the paranoid rage of Covington. None of it touched him, staring at the impossible face in the water. Knowing the story of the mother who had been so brutally broken, he was overwhelmed by a profound and crushing sorrow. It was a sorrow for Eliza, for her stolen child, for the countless, nameless others who had suffered similar fates. And beneath the sorrow, there was awe at the sheer power of a human spirit to leave such an indelible mark on the world, to turn the very element of its destruction into a timeless monument of its existence. He understood now. This was not a haunting, it was a vigil. He reached for his satchel, but not for his instruments. He pulled out his journal and his pen. By the faint light of the moon and the impossible glow from the water, he began to write, his hand steady, his purpose clear. "I came seeking a lie," he wrote, the words flowing not from the mind of a scientist, but from the heart of a witness, "and found a truth more real than any fact. My instruments are silent. They cannot measure grief. They cannot quantify injustice. The face in the water is not a trick of the light, nor is it a phantom of the mind. It is a wound in the world, refusing to heal. It is not a ghost in the water. It is a memory, held in place by the force of a great injustice, a mother's love made eternal." He closed the journal, his quest at an end. He had found his rational core, and it was not a trick of the light. It was the unbearable, undeniable truth of human cruelty, and the astonishing power of the human heart to remember it. The storm arrived not as a gradual gathering of clouds, but as a declaration of war. It rolled in from the Gulf, a bruised purple wall that swallowed the horizon and choked the afternoon sun, plunging Natchez into a premature, suffocating twilight. This was no ordinary summer squall. The air, which for days had been thick and stagnant, now crackled with a palpable, electric tension. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a high, shrieking howl, tearing at the Spanish moss, ripping shingles from rooftops, and sending dust and debris swirling through the streets in frantic, chaotic eddies. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against windows and turned the dusty roads into churning rivers of mud. Thunder followed, a relentless, percussive barrage that was not a sound in the distance, but a physical concussion that shook the very foundations of the houses, rattling bones and teeth. It was, the old-timers would later say, the worst storm in living memory, a biblical deluge, an act of God. And in the parlors and taverns, in the slave quarters and the great houses, a single thought took root in the minds of the people, a shared unspoken assumption: this will be the end of it. They imagined the Mississippi, the mighty, placid river, being whipped into a violent, muddy rage. They pictured the current scouring the riverbed, churning the silt, and erasing finally and forever the impossible serene face that had held the town captive. The storm was nature's fury, and in its awesome, indiscriminate power, it would surely wash away the unnatural memory that had taken root in the water. In his decaying mansion, the storm was not outside, it was inside. The howling wind was the scream that had been trapped in his own throat for months. The hammering rain was the frantic, desperate beating of his own heart. The thunder was the cracking of his own mind. Covington stood in the center of his grand, dust-choked parlor, a bottle of brandy clutched in his white-knuckled hand, and listened to the symphony of his own undoing. The world was being torn apart, and he felt a wild, terrifying kinship with the chaos. He saw the lightning flashes, stark, blue-white strobes that momentarily illuminated the room, revealing the peeling wallpaper, the cobwebs draping the chandelier like funeral shrouds, the ghostly shapes of furniture covered in white cloths. In those flashes, he saw her face, not in the water, but in the room with him, her eyes calm and judging from every dark corner. He had tried everything. He had tried denial, exorcism, rocks, and chains. He had tried to fight a memory with the brute force of the physical world, and he had failed. The reflection had endured, its silent, patient gaze, a constant, maddening indictment. Now, the heavens themselves had opened up, unleashing a power far greater than his own. He became convinced, with the unshakable certainty of a madman, that this was not a random act of weather. This was her. This was Eliza, wielding the storm as her final weapon. This was the ultimate confrontation, the final battle between his will and her memory. A strange, exhilarating clarity pierced through the fog of his paranoia and despair. He would not cower in his house while she tore the world down around him. He would meet her on the field of battle. He would go to the river. He slammed the brandy bottle down on a table, the sound lost in a deafening clap of thunder. He strode to a heavy oak chest and threw it open. His hands, trembling with a new and terrible purpose, retrieved a heavy horseman's pistol, its metal cold and solid in his grip. From a hook by the door he grabbed a storm lantern, its glass pane already rattling from the force of the wind against the house. Pistol in one hand, lantern in the other, he threw open the front door and stepped out into the maelstrom. He was no longer a planter, a master, a man of property. He was a soldier marching to his destiny, determined to end this war, one way or another. The walk to the river was a descent into hell. The moment Covington stepped from the shelter of his porch, the storm assaulted him with a personal, vindictive fury. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and nearly tearing the lantern from his grasp. The rain was a cold, blinding torrent that plastered his thin shirt to his skin and streamed into his eyes. The path, a gentle slope he had walked 1,000 times, was now a treacherous slide of slick, grasping mud that sucked at his boots with every agonizing step. He stumbled and fell, his hands sinking into the cold muck, the lantern swinging wildly, its flame guttering, threatening to die. He roared, a sound of pure, animalistic rage, and pushed himself back to his feet, his fine clothes now caked in mud, his face a mask of grim determination. He was a pathetic figure, a king reduced to a beggar, fighting a losing battle against elements that seemed to have allied themselves with the spirit of the woman he had wronged. The trees thrashed around him, their branches groaning like creatures in pain. A bolt of lightning struck a massive cypress tree nearby, splitting it down the middle with a sound like the cracking of a giant bone. The tree erupted in a brief incandescent blaze before the rain extinguished it, leaving behind the smell of ozone and burnt wood. Covington barely flinched. He was beyond fear of the natural world. His entire being was focused on the single, a mad purpose that drove him forward, one slipping, sliding step at a time, toward the raging river and the face that awaited him there. He finally reached the riverbank, his breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. He stood, swaying on his feet, and held the lantern high, its flickering light cutting a small, pathetic circle in the vast, roaring darkness. The sight before him was one of apocalyptic chaos. The Mississippi was no longer a river. It was a churning, boiling sea, huge, muddy waves, crested with foam, crashed against the bank, tearing away huge chunks of earth and pulling them into the current. The sound was a deafening, constant roar, a liquid thunder that vibrated through the ground and up into his bones. It was a world unmade, a vision of pure elemental power. And yet, as his wild eyes scanned the maelstrom, he saw it. In the midst of the violent, churning chaos, there was an island of impossible calm. It was a perfect circle of water, perhaps 20 feet across, as smooth and placid as a sheet of black glass. While the waves crashed and roared all around it, not a single ripple disturbed its surface. And in the center of that circle, illuminated by the frantic flashes of lightning and the weak glow of his own lantern, was Eliza's face. It was clearer, more present, more real than he had ever seen it before. Her features were sharp, her gaze direct. The serenity of her expression, set against the backdrop of the storm's fury, was no longer peaceful. It was terrifying. It was the calm at the absolute center of a hurricane, a point of infinite, unshakable power. The sight broke the last frayed thread of his sanity. All the rage, the guilt, the self-pity, and the terror that had been poisoning him for months erupted in a single cathartic torrent. He was no longer whispering to himself in his dusty study. He was screaming his confession into the teeth of the storm, his voice a raw, shredded thing that was nearly lost in the roar of the wind and water. "You!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling, mud-caked finger at the face in the water. "You thought you could escape me? You thought you could win?" He took a staggering step closer to the crumbling bank, his madness giving him a strange, new strength. "I broke you. I broke you." The words were torn from his throat, a confession that was also a boast, a last desperate assertion of the power he had lost. "I told you your precious child would suffer. I told you I sold her to the cane fields, where the sun would burn her alive. I watched the light go out of your eyes. I saw you break." He was weeping now, hot tears mixing with the cold rain on his face, but his expression was one of triumphant, ugly glee. He was reliving his victory, the one moment of absolute power that had led to his absolute ruin. "So why are you still here?" he screamed, the question a genuine, agonized plea. "You broke. You walked into the water. You are dead. Why are you still here?" The face in the water offered no answer. It simply watched, its calm, eternal gaze the only reply he would ever receive. The silence of the reflection was more than he could bear. It was a judgment, a verdict, a mirror showing him the pathetic screaming monster he had become. With a final guttural roar of pure, impotent fury, he raised the pistol. The metal was slick with rain, but his grip was like iron. He would obliterate it. He would fire his bullet into that serene face and shatter the image forever. He would put an end to the memory that had unmade him. He leveled the heavy barrel at the placid water, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that instant, as he prepared to commit his final futile act of violence against a ghost, the river rendered its judgment. It was not a random wave. It was something else. A huge, dark wall of water seemed to rise up from the churning chaos. A surge that was larger, faster, and more deliberate than all the others. It did not crash against the bank. It surged over it, a liquid arm reaching out of the maelstrom. The wave struck Covington with the force of a charging bull. It knocked him from his feet as if he were a child's toy. The pistol flew from his grasp, disappearing with a soft splash into the torrent. The lantern was extinguished, plunging him into absolute darkness, save for the strobing flashes of lightning. He opened his mouth to scream, but the river was already in his throat, choking him. He felt the powerful, irresistible tug of the current as it dragged him from the bank, his feet finding no purchase, his hands grasping at nothing but churning, muddy water. For a single, horrifying moment, a flash of lightning illuminated his face, his eyes wide with a final, shocking understanding. Then the darkness returned, and the river pulled him under, dragging him down into its cold, dark heart. He disappeared into the raging current, his final, choked cry swallowed by the roar of the storm, leaving behind nothing but the sound of the rain and the silent, watchful, and finally victorious face in the water. The storm passed as swiftly as it had arrived. The sun rose the next morning on a world washed clean, the air scrubbed of its oppressive humidity, leaving behind a crisp, cool clarity. In the aftermath of the tempest's fury, a profound and unnatural peace settled over the land. The Covington plantation, what was left of it, was silent. Covington's body was never found. The river, having delivered its judgment, kept its prize, pulling him down into the silt and the darkness, erasing him from the world of the living as completely as he had tried to erase Eliza. There was no funeral, no marker, no final word spoken over his name. He had simply vanished, consumed by the very element that held the memory of his greatest sin. The overseer, a man whose own petty cruelties had been but a pale reflection of his master's, walked through the ravaged grounds. He saw the splintered trees, the flooded fields, the great house standing silent and empty, a hollow monument to a collapsed dynasty. He saw the end of an era, the end of his own meager power. Without a word to anyone, he went to his small cottage, packed a single bag with his few belongings, and left, disappearing down the muddy road, another ghost fleeing the ruin. In the weeks that followed, the Covington plantation was dismantled by the cold, impersonal mechanics of law and debt. The land, the house, the equipment, all of it was broken up and sold off to satisfy creditors from as far away as New Orleans and Memphis. The name Covington, once a symbol of power and wealth in Natchez, became a whispered cautionary tale of madness and ruin. For the people Covington had owned, it was a time of chaos and terrifying uncertainty. Some were sold on the auction block in Natchez, their families torn apart once more, their lives just another entry in a different master's ledger. But in the confusion, With the power structure shattered and the gates unguarded, others saw a flicker of opportunity, a narrow path to a freedom they had only ever dared to dream of. They slipped away in the dead of night. In twos and threes, their faces turned toward the North Star, their hearts filled with a desperate, terrifying hope. Joseph was among them. Before he left the land that had been his prison for his entire life, he made one last pilgrimage to the river. The water was calm again, its surface a placid, muddy brown, flowing inexorably toward the sea. He stood at the spot, the sacred ground, and looked down. In the gentle morning light, he saw her, her face a quiet, constant presence. He no longer felt the urge to weep or to plead. His grief had been burned away, leaving behind a hard, clear understanding. He knelt and touched the water near the edge of the reflection, his fingers sending small ripples that dissipated before they could touch her image. "You're free now, Eliza," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're all gonna be free." He paused, the weight of his next words a solemn vow. "Thank you." He stood, turned his back on the river, and did not look back again. He walked away from the graves of his ancestors and the ghost of his friend, his steps light and sure, carrying Eliza's story of defiance not as a burden of sorrow, but as a shield and a sword for the long journey ahead. Alistair Finch packed his satchel with a sense of finality. His notebooks were full, his instruments lay unused, and his mind was heavy with a truth that felt too large and too strange for the rational world he was returning to. He had finished his article, a piece of writing that was less a journalistic report and more a raw, personal testimony. He knew the mainstream papers in Boston, with their sober columns and dedication to verifiable fact, would reject it. They would call it fantasy, the product of a mind gone soft in the southern heat. He didn't care. He folded the manuscript carefully and addressed it to a small, radical abolitionist journal, a publication that traded in the currency of moral outrage and believed that some truths were more important than mere facts. Before leaving Natchez, he sought out Hattie one last time. He found her sitting on her porch, watching the children of the newly freed play in the dirt, her expression one of weary, watchful peace. She had chosen to remain, to live out her days on the land she knew, a quiet anchor in a world that had been turned upside down. "They may not believe me, Hattie," Alistair said, standing before her, his hat in his hands. She looked up at him, her eyes holding the wisdom of ages. "It don't matter if they believe," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "The river remembers. That's what matters." Alistair nodded, understanding completely. He made one last trip to the riverbank, standing where he had first surrendered his skepticism. He looked down and saw the face, calm and eternal. He no longer saw it as a wound or a curse. He saw it as a memorial, a permanent and sacred testament to a life that had been stolen, but a spirit that could not be broken. He tipped his hat in a gesture of profound respect, turned, and walked away, leaving the river to its endless vigil. Years flowed into decades, and the river of time washed over Natchez, changing its face, but not its memory. The great storm that took Covington became a footnote, eclipsed by the far greater storm of the Civil War, a conflict that tore the nation apart and finally, brutally, broke the chains of bondage. Emancipation came, a promise fulfilled in law but deferred in practice, a new chapter of struggle and hope. The old plantations, with their crumbling columns and ghost, haunted histories, slowly decayed. The rhythmic churn of the paddle, wheelers gave way to the rumble of trains and, eventually, the drone of automobiles. The world modernized, grew louder, faster, and more complicated. Yet, the legend of the river, face of Natchez, endured. It shed its skin of immediate terror and awe, and settled into the comfortable clothes of folklore. It became a story told by grandparents to wide-eyed children, a warning to the arrogant and a comfort to the afflicted. Riverboat pilots, even in their modern diesel crafts, still gave the spot a wide, respectful berth, more out of tradition than genuine fear. The details grew fuzzy with each retelling. Eliza's name was sometimes forgotten, replaced by a generic woman in the water. The specifics of Covington's cruelty were softened, his monstrous reality sanded down into the shape of a simple villain. But the core of the story, the essential, powerful image, remained a permanent part of the landscape's identity, a truth that flowed just beneath the surface of the present. It is the 1970s. A young woman stands on the bank of the Mississippi River just outside of Natchez. She is an academic, a historian. Her field of study, the hidden narratives and suppressed voices of the past. She is African American, her presence on this particular patch of land a quiet testament to the battles fought and won in the century since Eliza's time. She has come here specifically, drawn by the enduring folklore of the river. Face, a story she had discovered in a fragile, yellowed copy of an old abolitionist journal, penned by a long-dead journalist from Boston. The sun is setting, casting a familiar, spectacular glow of orange and purple across the water, the same light that had illuminated Eliza's final moments of decision. The air is thick with the scent of honeysuckle and damp earth, and the sound of the cicadas is a low, constant hum. The woman has read all the accounts, the scientific explanations of light refraction, the psychological theories of collective hysteria. She is here not as a believer, but as a scholar, to see the place, to feel the history. She walks to the water's edge and looks down, her mind full of facts and footnotes. The river is just a river, brown and slow, its surface reflecting the fiery colors of the sky. She watches for a long time, feeling a sense of connection to the place, but seeing nothing more than water. She is about to turn away, to consign the story to the realm of powerful metaphor. When a cloud passes, the light shifts, and for a single, breathtaking instant, the glare vanishes, and she sees it. It is not a trick of the light. It is a face looking up at her from just below the surface. The face of a woman, her features calm, proud, and unblinking. It is not a ghost to be feared. It is an acknowledgement, a silent, profound connection across the chasm of 100 years. The young historian does not scream. She does not faint. She simply stands, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she looks into the eyes of her history. A single tear escapes and traces a path down her cheek, a tear not of sadness, but of a deep, resonant understanding and a powerful, humbling respect. The face holds her gaze for a moment longer, a silent communion between two daughters of a shared struggle. And then, as the light shifts again, it fades, dissolving back into the rippling reflection of the evening sky. The legacy is not forgotten. The river remembers, and in its remembering, ensures that the story of Eliza of Natchez and the unyielding strength of her spirit is never truly lost.